a bottle of rye whiskey, and a mule's worth of trouble. That's what a woman went for in Hatcher's Crossing, in the winter of 1878. Not a human being, never a human being, but nobody at the Broken Spur Saloon that Thursday night seemed to remember the difference. Josephine had stopped counting the days, sometime in October. After that, the cold just became a permanent condition. The same way the bruises did, the same way silence did. She was kneeling on the warped floorboards when the bidding started. Not because anyone had forced her down in that particular moment. She had just learned, over the course of 4 months with Cutter Dowd, that kneeling made the blows land differently. Less damage to the jaw. She had figured that out the hard way. The saloon smelled of tallow candles burning down to nothing, cheap tobacco, and the particular sourness of men who hadn't bathed since August. A piano in the corner played something optimistic that nobody was listening to. The fire in the stone hearth gave off more smoke than heat. Josephine stared at the grain of the floorboards and tried to memorize the knots in the wood. It was something to look at, that wasn't a face. Dowd had his fist knotted in her hair. Not tight enough to hurt right now, just tight enough to remind her he could. Fine worker. Doesn't eat much. Speaks when she's spoken to. He announced it to the room like he was describing a horse he'd broke. $40 or a decent rifle and I'll call it done. Someone near the back laughed. 30, said the barkeep. 35, said a man Josephine recognized as the mill owner, which made her stomach turn completely over. She kept her eyes on the floor. The bidding went the way these things went. She had learned by now not to track it too carefully. Tracking it meant hoping, and hoping meant the moment the gavel dropped felt like dying twice. She was aware of a new presence on her left. Not loud, not the of presence that announced itself. Just a stillness that was different from the room's general chaos. The kind of stillness that belongs to men who spend more time alone than among people. She registered boots first, heavy, cracked leather packed with trail mud, canvas trousers, a coat that smelled of pine resin and cold air from outside, the outdoor cold, not the indoor cold of this room. Whoever it was had come in recently. I'll close it, said the new voice. Low and flat like a stone dropped into still water. What's the number? 35, Dowd said, suspicious now. 40. Silence. Cash, the voice added, and something heavy and papery hit the bar counter. Not thrown. Set down with precision. Josephine finally looked up. He was tall in the way that men who live on mountains are tall, carrying it like a burden rather than a distinction. His face was weathered to the texture of old bark. Dark eyes set deep under a low brow, a jaw covered in a ragged beard threaded with gray even though he couldn't have been more than 40. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Dowd the way a man looks at something unpleasant he has to step over to get where he's going. Dowd released her hair. The man in the pine coat didn't offer her a hand up. He turned toward the door and said without looking back, "Come on, then." Josephine stood up. Her knees ached. She followed him out into the black, screaming cold of the November night, and didn't look back at the Broken Spur once. His name was Slade. Just Slade, he said when she asked, as if the single syllable was more than he was accustomed to offering. He had a horse tied at the post outside, a big, ugly gray gelding with a white blaze down its nose, and he loaded her onto it without ceremony, swinging up behind her and pulling the front of his heavy coat around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and disorienting. She hadn't been warm in months. She held herself stiff as a plank inside that warmth. She didn't lean back into it. The trail out of Hatcher's Crossing climbed immediately, switchbacking up through dark stands of lodgepole pine. The horse picked its way with the confidence of a creature that had made this trip hundreds of times. The cold deepened as they climbed. Josephine could feel it working at the places where the coat didn't quite reach, the gap at her collar, her wrists where the sleeves of her canvas dress ended. Nobody spoke. The horse's breath clouded in the moonlight. The pines closed around them. She spent the ride calculating. It was something she had gotten good at, the math of survival. He was bigger than her by a significant margin. He had a revolver on his right hip and what looked like a long skinning knife on his left. The horse was too large for her to control well. The mountain in the dark in this cold was not survivable on foot. She had maybe 30 seconds of advantage if she tried anything before the cold or the terrain finished what she started. She didn't try anything. The cabin appeared out of the dark like something the mountain had exhaled. Low-slung, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, the kind of structure that was meant to resist weather rather than welcome people. He tied the horse under a lean-to on the east side, rubbed it down with a rough cloth without rushing, gave it grain from a wooden bucket. Then he opened the cabin door and went inside. Josephine stood in the snow outside for a moment. The door stayed open, not wide, just ajar. Firelight from inside spilled in a thin wedge across the snow. She went in. The inside of the cabin was spare to the point of severity. A stone hearth, an iron stove, a rough table with one chair, a bed in the far corner that was more of a platform with a mattress ticking stuffed with something that smelled of dried grass, shelves of tins and dried goods, a row of iron hooks with tools and ropes and harnesses hanging from them, a single oil lamp, no decoration of any kind, no softness. He was crouching at the hearth, setting a fire with practiced efficiency. She stood near the door. In the light she could see his hands, scarred across the knuckles, thick through the palms, the left index finger slightly crooked from an old break that hadn't healed quite straight. She did the only sensible thing she knew how to do. She started to take inventory of the room for something useful, a second exit, a weapon within reach, the distance between the bed and the door. The fire caught. The heat rolled outward. He stood, turned, and looked at her properly for the first time since the saloon. She made herself hold still under it. "You eat today?" he asked. "No." He moved to the shelves without another word, pulled down a tin and set a pot on the stove. Beans from the tin, a handful of something dried from a cloth sack, a generous pour of water from a ceramic jug. He didn't look at her again while he worked. She watched his hands. You could tell most of what you needed to know about a man from his hands when he didn't know he was being watched. These hands were deliberate. They didn't grip too hard or move too fast. They set things down without slamming them. She had learned to read that. She had learned to read everything. The beans took a while. He added wood to the stove and sat on the single chair, pulling off his boots and setting them by the door. He was wearing thick wool socks underneath, worn at the heel. He didn't speak. The fire spoke. The wind outside spoke. The two of them sat in the not speaking like it was its own kind of language. When the beans were ready, he set the pot on the table with a spoon and stepped back. "Go ahead," he said. She ate standing up, closer to the door than to him, the spoon moving faster than was dignified. She didn't care. She had stopped caring about dignity sometime around the third week of October, when it became clear that dignity wasn't a currency that bought anything she needed. He watched the fire. When the pot was half empty, she made herself stop. She had learned that lesson too. Eat too much too fast after not eating and your body would punish you for it. She set the spoon down. She looked at him. He was still watching the fire. His profile in the firelight was all angles, the ridge of his brow, the jut of his jaw, the deep line that ran from his nose to the corner of his mouth. He looked like a man who had been through a thing or two and had stopped talking about it. "What do you want from me?" she said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat and practical, the way she'd learned to ask things that had stopped feeling like questions. He looked at her then. "Nothing tonight," he said. "There's a blanket on the peg behind you. Bed's in the corner. That's not what I asked." He looked back at the fire. A log shifted, sending a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I don't want anything from you," he said finally. His voice was careful in the way that some men are careful when they know their size is frightening. "I saw what was happening. I didn't like it. That's the whole of it." She studied his face. "Men always want something," she said. "I expect they do." He reached for a tin mug on the shelf, poured something from a clay jug, and set it at the far end of the table, away from himself. Not toward her, just available. "That's coffee from this morning, still warm enough." She didn't move toward it. "How long?" she asked. "How long what?" "Before you decide the $40 is worth collecting on." He set his own cup down. He turned on the chair to face her fully, his forearms on his knees, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't know how to name because nobody had aimed it at her before. It wasn't pity. It was something older and less comfortable than pity. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it straight," he said. "You don't owe me anything. Not work, not company, not anything else. When the pass clears in the spring, you take the gray horse and ride down to the valley. There's a town called Mineral Fork, 2 days' ride southwest. Methodist Church runs a house for women in your situation. Until then, you're out of the cold. That's all this is. Josephine looked at him for a long time. She was 23 years old. She had come west from Ohio with a man who had seemed decent at the time, which was the kind of mistake you only understood fully in retrospect. She had been a school teacher. She had been a person who owned books. She had at some point believed that the world was mostly navigable if you were careful enough. She no longer believed that. She picked up the coffee. It tasted like burnt grain and something earthy, and it was the best thing she had swallowed since July. He pointed at the bed. I sleep by the fire, door bars on the inside. Use it if you want. He pulled his coat back on, lay down on the floor in front of the hearth with his back to her, and went still with the economy of a man who had learned to sleep anywhere. Josephine sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the iron bar beside the door. She sat there for a long time. She didn't use the bar. She didn't sleep, either, not really. She dozed in the way she had learned to doze, one layer of awareness always on the surface, tracking sounds. His breathing evened out. The fire settled. The wind outside walked back and forth on the roof. The horse shifted in the lean-to. Nothing changed. No footsteps. No change in the quality of the silence. Sometime before dawn she slept. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of something being split outside. Real coffee, not warmed over this time. She lay still for a moment, which was a habit, taking inventory of the room before moving. Then she got up. He had left a tin basin of water on the stove, still warm. A rough cloth folded beside it. A sliver of brown soap. These things had been set out without comment, without ceremony, the way you might leave water out for an animal you weren't sure yet would trust you. She washed her face and hands. She stood at the small square window and watched him through the wavy glass. He was out in the snow at a chopping block, working through a pile of split logs with a methodical rhythm. He didn't look toward the window. She looked at her hands. They were wrong. Somehow, the wrongness of a thing taken out of its proper context. These were hands that had graded papers, hands that had pressed wildflowers in the back pages of dictionaries. They looked like they belonged to someone else now, chapped and rough, and mapped with small healed cuts she didn't always remember getting. She found a broom behind the door and swept the cabin floor. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't to prove anything. It was more that she needed something to do that wasn't waiting. He came in when the woodpile was restocked. He stamped the snow off his boots on the threshold, hung his coat, and turned to find her standing with the broom. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then he went to the stove and poured coffee into 2 mugs and set them on the table and sat down. She sat across from him. This was the first time they had sat at the same table, at the same level, and she found it strange in a way she couldn't immediately explain. The strangeness of being treated like a person who gets to occupy a chair. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Montana, originally. What brought you down here?" "Queter," he said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "You, Ohio, originally." He nodded like this explained something. She watched him drink his coffee. He didn't stare at her. He didn't calculate or assess or measure. He just drank his coffee and looked at the middle distance in the way of men who are accustomed to spending long stretches of time inside their own heads. "What's your full name?" she asked. "Slade Emmett. Josephine Hale." He nodded again. "Joe," he said, not asking, just testing the shape of it. "Josephine," she said. He accepted this without comment. They finished their coffee. He went out to tend to the horse. She found a pot and some dried beans and put them on to soak for the afternoon. It wasn't performing usefulness. She was genuinely cold and the fire was going and the beans needed soaking regardless of who did it. This was how the first week went. Small separate tasks moving in parallel. A shared table at meals. Words exchanged at the functional level. The weather. The state of the woodpile. What was left in the provisions tins. He fixed a gap in the chinking on the north wall. She mended a split in the oil lamp's wick. Neither of them commented on what the other did. At night she slept in the bed. He slept on the floor. She had been waiting for the thing that came next. The moment when the arrangement shifted, when the debt he was pretending he wasn't keeping came due. She had been waiting for it the way you wait for weather you can smell on the air but can't yet see. It didn't come. On the 9th day she stopped waiting quite so hard. On the 14th day a storm came down off the ridge and sealed them in completely. 3 days of white fury that made the cabin walls shudder and drove snow under the door, despite the rag he had stuffed in the gap. The cold was a physical presence inside the cabin now, something with weight and intention. They kept the fire burning through the night, taking turns without discussing it, one of them waking when the other got up to add wood. On the second night of the storm, she woke to find the fire dangerously low and Slade asleep on the floor, deeper under than usual, the way you sleep when exhaustion finally wins. She got up and added the wood herself. She sat in the chair for a while after, watching the flames come back. In the firelight, with his guard down in sleep, he looked younger. The hard lines of his face softened. There was something around his eyes that she recognized without quite being able to name. The marks that particular kinds of loss leave on a face, not fresh grief. Old grief, the kind that had gone quiet. She had it too. She could feel it in her own face sometimes when she caught her reflection in the window glass. She went back to bed, but she lay there looking at the ceiling for a long time. On the third morning of the storm, with the snow still coming, she started to talk. Not about anything important at first, just the way her grandmother had made apple butter every autumn, the specific smell of it. The way the schoolhouse in Carver, Ohio had a crack in the east window that whistled in the wind. Small things, unimportant things. He listened. He didn't fill in the silences when she paused. He didn't make the things she was saying about himself. By afternoon she was talking about the man who had brought her west. She didn't use his name. She just said him, and Slade seemed to understand that this was enough. She told it the way it had actually happened, which was not a clean or simple story. The way Decent had curdled slowly. The way she had excused things she shouldn't have until the excuses ran out. The way fear became a texture rather than an event, something woven into everything rather than a thing that came and went. Slade listened to all of it. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. The storm pressed at the walls. "You're not stupid for believing someone," he said finally. "People fool you. That's on them, not you." It was such a simple thing to say. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't have made her eyes sting. She looked out the window at the white nothing. "What happened to you?" she asked. "The old thing, the quiet one." He was quiet for a long time. "Wife," he said. 7 years ago. Fever took her inside of a week. Took our boy too, he was 4. He paused. "I came up here after. Didn't intend to stay as long as I have." She looked at his hands on the table. "I'm sorry," she said. 7 years is a long time to be sorry, he said. "I'm less sorry than I was." The storm broke overnight. By morning the sky was a violent scrubbed blue, and the snow lay over everything in a silence that had its own particular weight, clean and total and indifferent. Slade went out early to dig out the door and clear the lean-to. Josephine made coffee and cornmeal mush and set it on the table. When he came in, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway for a moment, looking at the set table. He didn't say anything, but something in his face rearranged itself slightly, so briefly she almost didn't catch it. He sat down. They ate. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Not soft, exactly. The cold didn't soften. The work didn't soften. But something had shifted in the air between them. The way a room feels different after the windows have been opened, even just for a minute. She began sleeping through the night. She noticed this the way you notice the absence of pain, suddenly and with a confusing amount of feeling. She had not slept through the night since before Ohio. Of the realizing of it made her lie still in the gray morning light for a long time, taking inventory of something that felt less like danger and more like the possibility of not danger, which was its own strange country. She began to learn him in the way you learn a place you're spending time in, not all at once but in accumulations. He drank his coffee without sugar. He talked to the gray horse in a low voice that was different from the voice he used with people. More patient, less careful. He had a book, just one, a battered copy of Moby Dick with half the spine missing, and he read it in the evenings with total absorption, the same book he had presumably read many times before. He was not someone who laughed easily, but when something struck him genuinely funny, the laugh came from somewhere real, brief and unguarded, and then he would look slightly prized by it. She began to think about what she would do in the spring, not with dread, but as a practical question. Mineral fork of a Methodist house. A life she would have to build from component parts she hadn't yet acquired. She thought about this while she was chopping carrots one afternoon in February, the knife working in the cold air of the cabin above. She thought about it the same way she thought about Slade, which was, carefully, from a distance, not letting herself get too close to what she actually thought, in case what she actually thought turned out to be something she couldn't manage. She was still thinking when the sound started. First the gray horse, screaming in the lean-to, then hoofbeats in the snow, then two riders coming over the ridge. Slade was at the door before she had fully turned around. She knew from the way he moved, fast but controlled, that he had already calculated what this was. She looked through the window, Dowd, and beside him, the mill owner from the Broken Spur, a broad-shouldered man named Wick Gruner, who had always looked at her like something he'd already decided he was going to have. She had known they might come. She had told herself she hadn't known, but she had known. "Go to the back wall," Slade said, his voice level. "I'm not going to the back wall." He looked at her once, sharply, then back at the door. He took the revolver from the hook by the door, checked the cylinder, and stepped outside. She heard Dowd's voice, oily and reasonable, the way it always was before it turned. He was saying something about his property, his investment, his rights. She heard Slade say, "You'll want to turn those horses around." She heard Dowd say something else. She looked at the shelf by the door. There was a second revolver there, an older one, a .36 cap and ball that Slade used for smaller game. She took it down and checked the loads. Her hands were not shaking. This surprised her. She thought about why her hands were not shaking and decided it was because she was done letting things happen to her. That was the difference. She went to the door. Slade heard her and turned, and for just a moment his expression went through something complicated. But he had no time to deal with it because Gruner was raising a rifle and Dowd was going for something on his belt. What happened next was fast and ugly and entirely without heroism, which is how these things actually go. Slade took Gruner's rifle away from him by grabbing the barrel and using it to pull the man off his horse. He hit Gruner once efficiently, and Gruner folded. Dowd's draw was slower than he thought it was, and in the moment it took him to clear leather. Josephine had the .36 centered on his chest. She had shot a man before. That man was still alive, technically, but she'd meant to stop him, and she had. She knew how to do this. She held the gun steady and looked at Cutter Dowd down the barrel and waited. Dowd looked at the gun. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him put his hands up. "Unloaned it," she said, "the belt, everything." He did. His fingers were unsteady. Hers were not. Slade had Gruner upright and disarmed by then, both men's horses' reins gathered in one fist. "You ride out of here," Slade said to Dowd, his voice carrying no heat, just instruction, "and you don't come back. Ever. You come back, I'll find you before the weather does. Are we clear?" Dowd nodded, the nod of a man who has suddenly remembered he has other things to do. Slade released the horses. The two men rode away fast, not looking back, growing small against the endless white of the ridge. The silence came back. Josephine lowered the gun. She noticed that her hands had started shaking now, which was the right order for things to happen. Slade turned and looked at her. She looked at him. He came toward her through the snow. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could see the pulse in his jaw. "You all right?" he said. "Yes. You're shaking, I know. That's the normal order of things. You shake after, not during." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out, slowly, his rough hand open and visible, the way you'd approach something you weren't sure of, and he set it on her shoulder, just rested it there, heavy and warm. She stood in it for a moment. Then she stepped in close and pressed her forehead to his shoulder and let the shaking work itself out. He put his other arm around her, loose and careful. She could feel him breathing. She could feel the cold on the outside of his coat and the warmth coming through from underneath. After a while the shaking stopped. She stepped back. She looked up at him. His dark eyes were doing something she recognized because she had seen it in mirrors. "Spring is a long way off still," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I've been thinking about Mineral Fork." She paused. "I've been thinking I'm not sure it's what I want." He was very still. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was careful in the way it had been careful the first night, that awareness of his own size, not using it, holding it deliberately in check. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the mountain. She looked at the gray horse in the lean-to, watching them with calm, ancient eyes. I want to decide for myself, she said, not because it's cold, not because I have nowhere else to go. When the pass is clear, I want to make a choice. All right, he said, and I want you to be honest with me about what you want. Not polite, not careful, honest. He looked out at the ridge where Dowd's tracks were already beginning to fill with new snow. I have been honest, he said. I've wanted you to be safe. I wanted that from the first night. He paused. I want more than that now, Dove. But I'm not asking you for anything. She looked at him for a long time. I know you're not, she said. That's why I'm asking you. The sky above the ridge was going orange at its edges, the short winter day already burning out. Gov. The cold was coming back with the dark, wrapping around the mountain, settling into the snow with a sigh. She turned and walked back inside. She picked up the pot from the stove and checked the beans she had put on that morning. They were nearly done. She added salt and a sprig of dried thyme from the bunch hanging by the window and put the lid back on. Behind her, she heard him come in. She heard the door close. She heard him hang his coat on its peg and set his boots by the door. She heard him pull out the second chair. When she turned around, he was sitting across the table from where she usually sat. Both mugs in front of him, the coffee already poured. She sat down. Outside, the mountain did what mountains do, standing enormous and indifferent in the cold, holding everything up without being thanked for it. The fire in the hearth talked to itself. The horse settled in the lean-to. The smell of beans and thyme filled the cabin with the uncomplicated smell of something nourishing, made from nothing special, just time and heat and a small amount of care. Josephine picked up her coffee. She wasn't sure yet what the spring would bring. She thought she might decide to find out.